Hello dear friends, I'm Samuel Moore and welcome to Talking Music, the show where you get to enjoy long-form discussions with superb and fascinating musicians. My brilliant and returning guest today is the classical guitarist and composer Laura Snowden. Laura, welcome to Talking Music.
Hello, yay, it's nice to be back.
The pleasure is ours, Laura. Thank you for coming back. Now, Laura, I think it's fair to say that most people watching and listening, particularly as you're a returning guest, are likely already familiar with both you and your work. But for those who aren't, could you please start by giving us a very quick overview of what's been your journey through life that has led you to be sitting here today?
So I'm a guitarist and composer and also sometimes vocalist. The music I grew up with when I was a child was very much folk music. That's what my dad played and what we had playing in the house. And my mum is Breton, so there's quite a lot of Breton music as well. And then my training has been in classical guitar and in composition. So there's been a lot of different teachers, mentors, collaborators that have helped and guided me along the way.
Well, that's wonderful, Laura, and thank you for that very succinct overview of your journey. Now, I better lay my cards on the table right away, Laura. I've invited you back on the show for a very specific reason, and one that you were too modest to mention just now. You've just had quite a big moment in your musical journey, because you've just released your debut solo album. Firstly, a very warm congratulations, that's a huge achievement. And secondly, could you start by telling us a little bit about it? I want to really unpack it in today's session. So what's the album called, what's it about, and crucially, where can people get it?
So it's called This Changing Sky, and it consists of 10 of my own compositions and then 2 of my folk song arrangements. And it features some special guests. It's got a saxophone player called Amy Green, a violinist, Ju Young Sir, and then a bassist, Loz Garrett, who's also the bassist for the jazz singer Jamie Cullum. And the album is, the individual tracks can be listened to as standalone pieces, and they all are intended to work as standalone pieces and could be, part of a playlist that is relevant to that piece. But at the same time, because I really love listening to a whole album in its entirety, that's just such a pleasure for me. And a lot of my favourite albums have been ones that have some kind of sense of narrative or story or something across them. The album is also intended, if people have the time and the desire, to be listened to as a whole. So it's also meant to be a journey. And the story of the album is very much about feeling like you've lost your sense of self, and then it's the path to finding your way back, which can be quite turbulent. But along the way, there's a lot of tender music, which is representing like the people that we love who help us on our way. But the ultimate message at the end of it is meant to be a healing and a hopeful one, even though it goes to dark places on its journey.
Well, that's a wonderful overview to kick us off with. And crucially, Laura, where can people get it from if they'd like to buy it?
Well, I've put it on Bandcamp. It's as either a digital download or in various territories, it can be posted as a CD. And then it will also be on the usual streaming platforms and download places and whatever online.
Wonderful. Well, it's worth saying from the outset, I absolutely love this recording. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And thank you very much for kindly sharing some of the tracks with me in advance of us having this conversation.
Yay, thank you. That's great.
My pleasure. Now, I've been thinking about how we can have this conversation today. And one thing that strikes me about this album, it's the thing I like most about it, is just how unique and how you this album is. With that in mind, Laura, before we talk about specific tracks, I think we need to unpack the album in a much more general sense first. I wonder if a good place to start is this. I think it's fair to say that most people think of you as a classical guitarist. Now, if I were to go out onto the street right now and stop random people and say, describe to me what you think a classical guitar album would sound like, I hazard a guess they'd say something like this. They'd probably say a classical album is where a virtuoso classical musician, someone like Laura Snowden, performs compositions by famous composers in the classical canon, most of whom are no longer alive. They'd probably go for names like Bach, Fernando Sor, Francisco Tárrega, that sort of thing. Now, the reason I bring that up, and I think I can see there's a ghost of a smile on your face here, you can kind of tell where I'm going with this. That stereotypical description doesn't describe your debut solo album. Your album is very much your musical voice from start to finish, because you are the composer and or arranger, and also the performer on every single track. Let's unpack that a little bit. Why did you want to go down that specific route for your debut album, Laura?
I think I've waited a long time to record an album, to such a degree that I had a mentor who, she said to me at some point, maybe about 7 years ago, she was like, what the hell is this about? Like, why do you not have an album? And I think part of me felt like when I released my first album, I wanted to be of my own music. And that doesn't mean that every album I will ever make will be that way. It's just something that I felt. And I kept thinking, can I really do that? And so it was a real sort of internal struggle for me to, and I think maybe that's why it took so long as well, because I kept thinking, oh, you should do what people may be expecting and what you should do. But then I just thought, if I actually have to do it, and because it's a lot of work, it's a lot of effort, it takes a lot of time, and to see the whole thing through, I felt like it's probably better for me and for my brain if I do it with something that I feel really, really, really committed to, because then I'll do it more fully, and sort of keep it up until the end and not give up because it's something that I so want to do. And it's to some degree, I also feel like when you do something, you don't know what the effect of it is going to be anyway. You don't know how it's going to be received. So if I had some kind of guarantee that, like, if you do an album of these sort of classic composers as expected, then you will receive this and this and this. That might be like, hey, you know what? If it's guaranteed, I'll do it. But because you don't know what anything will result in anyway. So I sort of felt then that the best thing for me would be just to do what my vibes are telling me. But it was a difficult decision, and I remember angsting over it a lot because I was thinking, yeah, sort of, can I really do this?
Wonderful. That's an absolutely splendid answer, Laura. And it kind of sounds that what you're kind of saying is if you were going to put a debut album out that would take all of that time and effort, you wanted it to in some way reflect who you were as a person as well as an artist. Is that a fair summary?
I'm trying to think. I don't know what the difference is. Yeah, I don't think that's how I feel particularly. I don't know who I am as a person.
Well, the reason I mention it is quite simple. For those of us who've known you for a while, we know that the theatre, drama, acting have long been quite an important part of who you are as a person. And the reason I kind of presented it the way I did was, that side of your personality has really come out quite beautifully on this album. Because yes, this is a fantastic guitar album, but you've also combined other elements of your artistry within that. For example, you know, all your tracks, for the most part, they've got music, and then they have spoken word characters as performed by yourself whilst performing. There's acting elements in some of them. You've even collaborated with dancers on some of them. It's performance art in a much broader sense. It's a great guitar album, but it's more than that. So I suppose what I was trying to get at was, at what point in your wider musical journey did you decide to let that side of your personality really come through in your compositions that are now featured on this album?
Yeah, I don't know if there's been any specific point. I think I've sort of tried to do what feels authentic and true, and I can see that when I've spoken to people in the past, I've said that, oh, when I was young I wanted to be an actor, and then there seems to be a connection between that and some of the things that I'm doing now, where I'm speaking maybe in the pieces, and it's got what you could call a theatrical element. But I guess I didn't think sort of like, oh, I'll do that because that has a theatrical quality and connects with my interest in theatre. It's more like the ideas just came to me, and I sort of went with them. So I feel like it's been a very natural evolution, and there hasn't been, I don't think there has been a specific turning point. I do remember when I started writing, we'll probably come to this later, but one of the pieces on the album called The Trap, and I felt sort of really nervous the first time I played it to somebody. I played it to one of my housemates, and I was so nervous, and I was thinking, this is, in the first time I performed it as well, it seemed like a really sort of wild thing to be doing, but now it all feels very normal.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose it ties in with what you were saying earlier, in that it sounds like for you, the person you are and the artist you are not separate entities, they're one and the same. Is that fair?
I've never thought about it before. I'm trying to think. I don't really know. I don't know, because I think when you're creating art, you're sort of putting certain things forward, and there are obviously sides of you that are not present, that are there in real life. So I wouldn't say they're one and the same, but I do feel that I bring my whole self to the things that I'm trying to create.
That makes a lot of sense. Wonderful. So I'd like to touch on another aspect of this album that I think is quite unique and that I love about it. And I think in order to present this one, I'm going to have to talk about what the general cultural zeitgeist is and then compare it with what you've done. So I don't like stereotyping, but there is that trend in the music world at the moment. And I think it's probably a product of the fact that a lot of music these days is consumed online, on Spotify, on YouTube. And what this sometimes results in is guitar composers, for want of a better phrase, front-loading their compositions with virtuosic displays of speed, technique, all that sort of stuff to try to grab people's attention. I'm not saying that I'm not criticising that that's a thing. I'm rather commenting that it is a thing, if that makes sense. It's a description rather than an insult. I don't have strong opinions one way or the other. The reason I bring it up, though, is although that is the general trend and it's a product of the world we live in, that doesn't describe the music you tend to produce as a composer. When I think of your compositions, particularly the ones on this album, I tend to think of more subtle aspects of artistry. I tend to think of creative use of tone colour. the communication of a specific feeling in a composition, or a narrative you're trying to impart through that composition. And I'd like to unpack a little bit where that's come from. Is it a conscious choice to kind of go against that trend I just described? Or is it more a natural thing that just comes out? Is that how you hear music?
Whatever I'm writing is just whatever's coming into my brain. But I think it's influenced by my reference points and the music that I listen to. And I guess if I think about it, there's almost nothing that I listen to that would probably be described as flashy or virtuosic in maybe the traditional sense. Even though I can really appreciate the value of music that has those kind of qualities. And in concerts, I think that can be really thrilling and exciting to see as well. When I'm listening to music by myself, I can't really think of anything that I listen to that I would describe as virtuosic particularly, even though actually there's a lot of skill going into it, but it doesn't overtly hit you as being virtuosic. Although if you actually think about what they're doing, it's like, whoa, how are they doing that? And like, I like music that has a really good groove. I listen to loads of stuff that has a groove, and that can be often a kind of fast groove. But I guess like the individual notes being played are not like fast in themselves, even if it creates a fast groove. So I think I'm probably just influenced by the things that move me and the things that I gravitate towards and the things that I listen to.
Could I ask a follow-up to that? So what sort of things do you tend to listen to? What are your preferred listening preferences?
Yeah, it depends. I've gone through different phases. I tend to go very much in phases and listen to something a lot. So like, I just list random things that I have been listening to of late, and then this gives you some kind of idea. I love Ralph McTell, the singer-songwriter. That he just had his 80th birthday celebrations at the Royal Festival Hall, and I went, and it was so beautiful. And he writes a lot of music that's his songs, and a lot of them are so tender and warm. And like, that concert, I cried the whole way through. It was so beautiful, but it just felt like a warm hug, the whole thing. It was so warm and compassionate and kind. It was so beautiful. And then lately I like listening to Chopin, but I tend to listen to the more slow ones. I like listening to Horowitz playing Chopin, but I like the tenderness again. So I think I'm really drawn to tenderness and sort of warmth. And then I do like trancey music, like sort of electronic, dancey music that's very trancey. I like Breton music for that reason, because it's very repetitive, and so there are some bands that take Breton music, like the traditional ideas, and sort of mix it with more rock or pop elements or electronic elements, and I like that. But at its core, it's something sort of hypnotic and trancey, almost like that you kind of zone out to, but not in a like, oh, I'm zoned out, but sort of just that you get into a zone. And then I think the artists that I really like at the moment, that I've been listening to a lot over the last few years, would be like Sinead O'Connor. I love the expressiveness in her voice. I just think it's so, like, just one note, it's just like, it just hits me. Kate Bush, I love. FKA Twigs, Björk, Little Sims, Billie Eilish. I'm obsessed with her latest album, Hit Me Hard and Soft. And then like Laurie Anderson. So a lot of those people, I guess, to the summary for what they do might be, I mean, of course, they're all completely different, but they're quite holistic in their approach. They're sort of it's like might be about the visuals, the words, the dance, the music, the sounds, everything. So yeah, I don't really know how you could summarize all of those different things, but those are the sort of range of influences that I feel are quite strong on me at the moment.
That's very interesting. And I noticed as well with some of the, again, you were describing feelings that were being communicated, like very specific feelings or a particular mood that a particular performer created. And again, I sense that in your album as well. That's fascinating. I'm very curious, given that there's a lot of acting and drama and spoken word on the album as well, do you have particular favourites in that area of endeavour as well? Do you have particular actors that you particularly find interesting, or spoken word people that you particularly find interesting?
Not particularly. I feel like those are areas that I actually don't really know very much about. And so I think in terms of lyrics, probably the things that I'm inspired by most are songwriters and songs. I used to read a lot when I was a child. I read loads and loads and loads of books, and I was very into creative writing. And I still like to read, but for example, I really don't read very much poetry at all, and that's not because I don't like it. It's actually when I read a poem on occasion, I'm kind of stunned, and I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. But it's just, I don't know why, it just doesn't seem to be part of my current lifestyle. And then, yeah, with acting, I think I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think a lot of what I watch on TV is sort of stuff to numb my brain a little bit, like, so I don't think it's sort of the deepest of stuff. Which is interesting. I like it. I engage in some things in a way to just kind of zone out, and then other things where I want real intensity of emotion. So probably with the lyrics, I think it's mostly just the influence of songwriters.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I'd like to ask one final question about the album in a general sense, before we dive into specific tracks. You kind of touched on this a little bit in your introduction. When I first listened to this recording, I was struck by the plethora of musical influences you could hear in your guitar sound. As a composer, I mean. Obviously, you're primarily a classical guitarist, so that's a very strong thread. But I could hear folk influences in there as well. I could even on some tracks hear the sorts of harmonies I tend to associate with contemporary jazz in some respects. And I don't want to go too much into detail with specific tracks at this stage, but it'd be very interesting just to unpick the tapestry a little bit and see where those fit into your wider musical journey and how it shaped that sound that comes out on this recording.
Yeah, I do think that the folk music, because that feels like the first music that I heard, that feels, it's almost like in my head, that's the music, that's the original music, and everything else is like, oh, it's a different kind of music. But that's just because that's the first thing that I've heard. And so, like the idea of, for example, singing a simple folk song or singing in harmonies with someone, not that there's any harmony singing on the album, or a kind of a simple groove, like, yeah, with on a Breton tune or something. Those feel like fundamental things that maybe underpin quite a lot of what I like to do. And then Ralph McTell, actually, I mentioned him earlier, but that very warm, compassionate singer-songwriter, he was one of the reasons that I was interested in classical guitar to begin with, because I heard his recordings that my dad was listening to. I mean, he's not a classical guitarist, but I just liked the sound of the guitar. And what I really liked, and I still love about him, like I say, is the warmth. It's the warmth in the voice. It's the warmth in the guitar sound. The guitar, accompaniments, like just what he's choosing to do, the music itself, the lyrics, everything. So I think that sort of idea of warmth and tenderness, which again then comes back to like the Chopin that I was saying, that again, that to me has that quality. And then through classical music, I feel like I've heard a lot of different things, and certain things have really spoken to me. John Tavener has really spoken to me because of that sense of it's like hearing the sound itself, and like the sound itself having a meaning, and the contemplative nature of his music and the space and the silence. I've gone through a particular time when I loved Messiaen and I was listening to him a lot. So these all things, like, they don't really make any sense because in my mind it all makes a lot of sense and it's all like connected as one thing, but they are all really diverse influences. And yeah, so I think you're right, because I've taken a lot of different sounds, and so that's probably why you hear a lot of different influences. And also, like, say with the classical guitar, I love Barrios, the Paraguayan composer. His slow pieces, I think, are just unbelievably amazing. I was just like, I can't believe who wrote these. It's so good. And so that's the tenderness again, I think, which I really appreciate, and that something can be so tender, especially on a classical guitar, but it kind of links with the Chopin. I don't think that really answered your question. I think I just listed a bunch of random composers.
No, I think what's quite interesting about it is it ties in with the conversation I had with you when you first came on Talking Music, because one thing that came out very strongly is a lot of the musicians you seem to like the most, what links them all together is actually quite simple. It's that they've kind of transcended their instrument. You're not talking about them as a guitarist. You're talking about them as a musician who is communicating a kind of universal truth, and the medium through which they are doing that might happen to be the piano or the guitar or the voice or whatever. But that's the thing that links them. You know, the joke I sometimes make is, I don't think of Miles Davis as a trumpet player. He kind of exists in this world of mists and spirits, and the trumpet just happens to be what it comes out of. But I don't think of him as a trumpet player, in the same way that I think of Wynton Marsalis as a trumpet player. You know what I mean? I very much think of him in that capacity, but Miles is a different beast. And I kind of get the impression that's what links a lot of these artists together. That's certainly what I'm hearing when I'm talking to you. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's really true, and I think it's the way that they transmit a certain feeling. And I suppose there are certain feelings that I am more interested in than others. So, for example, I keep saying tenderness, for example. So clearly I have a thing where I just like tender things. So if anyone can transmit me tenderness, whether that's Ralph McTell or Chopin or Barrios, I'm like, great, bring it on. But so it's not so much about like what the style is, it's about the emotion that they give me. And then there might be some other types of emotions that for whatever reason I'm like a bit less wanting in my music. And I also like, I love things that I love music that feels very guttural, and like I love deep bass sounds. So I think I hear music in quite a physical way. That's why John Tavener I really like, because a piece like The Lamb, say his choral piece, is very simple, but you have a feeling of grounding and sort of earthness and from the basses, which are very, very low, and then the soaring high singers on top. So I feel it very physically. I like music that kind of gives me chills, and I like to feel my music through my whole body.
I think that's a wonderful answer. I think that's a wonderful answer, and absolutely, it does make perfect sense once you drill down into it. And I know what you mean. If you skim the surface of it, you might think, well, how does this all relate?
Yeah.
But the minute you actually start to dig into it, you realise, actually, this makes perfect sense. And we've just come to that conclusion. That's wonderful.
Great, gosh, that's the first time I've ever felt like I might make some sense. It's logic after all.
I'm happy to help.
Yeah, can I see you more often?
So, this kind of leads me quite nicely to where I wanted to go next, because we've kind of unpacked the album in a general sense to try to give people an overview of what's this like as an immersive experience. I'd now like to turn to specific tracks. And I wonder if a good place to start is to look at some of the tracks you've released as singles. Largely because I think they are likely the ones that our watchers and listeners probably have had the most exposure to already. So let's start with those. Let's begin with the first single you released for the album, the track entitled Picking Up the Pieces. Now, I absolutely love this track, and there's loads of reasons why, but I don't think people have come to watch and listen to this to hear me gush about why I think it's great. They want to hear your perspective, the composer and artist perspective. With that in mind, Laura, unpack this track for us a little bit. What themes underpin it, and what does it mean to you?
So the idea behind the piece is I wanted it to feel like a warm hug through tears. So it would be, for example, someone's had some kind of experience. It could be a long time ago. It could be something recent. It could be like a one-off experience. It could be something more long-term that they've been going through for a long time. And it's an experience that has been difficult for them. And they're just coming out of the experience. And they go, for example, they go home, like to their, let's say to their parents, it could be, but it depends on the person, you know. I'm just saying a random version of this story, that they would go home to their parents and their parents sort of look after them and take care of them and gradually help them to rebuild things. So, but it could be they go to anybody, anyone who is that figure for them that might help them and help them to rebuild after something difficult. And so it's sort of the feeling that that person is giving them a hug and saying, it's okay, everything's going to be okay, and like looking after them and taking care of them, and helping them to rebuild.
It's really interesting, you know, because I suppose if kind of rebuilding and, for want of a better word, kind of healing, if that was the theme you were going for, I think you've really encapsulated it beautifully. And I think I'm trying to articulate this well. I don't think it's just the notes you've composed and the way you've played it that have achieved that. When I first listened to it, what really hit me was the choice of instrumentation. That pairing of nylon string guitar and tenor saxophone, it works really well for communicating that kind of that warmth and that very relaxed, calming, I've arrived home feeling. But it's not a very common instrument pairing. It's not one that a composer would naturally gravitate towards, yet you found it. So what led you to that choice? And once you'd chosen it, how did that subsequently influence what you composed?
Well, I have a thing about the tenor saxophone. I've always had a thing about it. I find it so warm and comforting, and like I love Stan Getz, and I remember there was when I was in a folk band, our bassist was called Heddy, and he had a band called Olivia's Owls, and they had this one track that, well, I mean, they had lots of tracks actually with the tenor saxophone, but there was just one that I loved. It had a beautiful kind of animation that goes with it, where it's raining. You can find it on YouTube, and it was so beautiful. I just loved that sound of that tenor saxophone so much. So I kept thinking, I really want to write a piece for tenor saxophone and guitar, because guitar is also very tender, and I play guitar, so I guess it's sort of logical. But yeah, so and then I happened to know a very good saxophone player, because Amy Green, because she played on a previous track of mine with the Vida Guitar Quartet. She played soprano sax on that one, I think. And she's really, really, really good, and she can sort of bring so much emotion to just anything. I mean, she could just bring it just like that, like every take. It's really incredible. And so actually, she was the first person, I think, that I've ever written a piece for where it wasn't a commission, or like they hadn't asked me to. I was like, can I write this for you, please? So then it became quite a special thing, because I went round to her house on a number of occasions and tried out little bits as I was trying to learn how to write for the instrument. And she was a real help with the whole process.
That's really, really interesting. So it reminds me a little bit of, I'm thinking some of my heroes like Duke Ellington. He never wrote for a generic big band. He wrote for the specific players in his big band. And it sounds a little bit like that's how you were working on this.
Yeah, I think so. I was trying stuff out with her, and it was interesting because I wanted to write something really simple, and that was a big part of the challenge in a way. It was, I kind of wanted to distill the whole thing down to its essence and not complicate it. And sometimes writing something simple like that can actually be really hard. So it probably sounds like, oh, you just kind of came up with that, like whatever. But I found it really difficult, actually.
I think it's because it's a thing I say to my students a lot. People conflate two words that sound the same, but they're not. They think simple and easy are the same thing, and they really aren't. Trying to write something to a mediocre standard that's complicated is relatively easy, because the complexity kind of buttresses you. But you strip it down to a few chords and a very simple part, unless you play that with absolute commitment and conviction, and with a real command of what you're trying to do. Good luck. It won't sound good unless you have all of that together.
Yeah, that's true.
No, it's wonderful. It really is a wonderful, wonderful composition. And how did the choice of the instrument actually affect what you wrote? Did you have a particular melody in mind for saxophone, and so on and so forth? Did you edit the score a lot based on what was being done with the instruments?
I think the way I composed it was that I was singing the saxophone part to myself and playing the guitar part. So I guess I was singing with the tenor saxophone in mind. But I just always visualized it on tenor saxophone from the beginning. So I don't think it had any particular effect exactly, because it was just how I saw it from the start.
That makes a lot of sense. I'd like to ask a follow-up, if I may, and I want to be very careful how I frame this, because I'm asking this because I suspect there's going to be a really interesting answer. It's not a criticism. Again, I think I'll have to juxtapose what would be the norm with what you've done here. When people release a debut solo album to feature them as an instrumentalist, the first single, generally speaking, is them front and centre as the artist. It's very much, this is me, what I represent, and the spotlight is right on me. I find it very interesting that your choice of first single doesn't fit that description. You've gone for essentially something that beautifully evokes a lot of the themes underpinning the album, but it's very much an ensemble performance. It's you accompanying someone playing a melody that you've composed. With that in mind, Laura, unpack that for us a bit. Why did you want this specific track to be the debut single of your debut album?
That's a very good question, because so a lot of my friends who are not musicians, this track has really spoken to them and they really like it, which I really like, because I like the idea of people who are not musicians liking something that I've done. And one of them, he was like, he kind of said similar to you. He was like, it's not a criticism, but he was like, oh, this one seems more like the guitar is kind of more of an accompaniment. Is that correct? And I was like, oh, that's a good point. And then I thought, why did I release this one first? So I didn't even think of this, which is really strange. But I'll now tell you the logic as to why I did choose it. So I wanted the first two singles to be pieces that are new or new-ish. Because they represent like the latest in my development and probably more succinctly summarize what it is that I'm trying to do and to say with the album. And specifically, I felt that the trap, which we'll come to, I felt like that sort of summarizes all of the dark parts of the album. So that one is kind of like, this is what the problem is. And then picking up the pieces kind of encapsulates the healing part or the tender part of the whole thing. So that encapsulates that. And so my only question so I knew it should be those two, and they're a bit more substantial in length. And I just really liked picking up the pieces, and it was a piece that I'd wanted to write for so long, and I'd had this thing of this tenor saxophone idea for such a long time, I felt like, oh, I really captured what I wanted to with this one, and it's quite new, so it's a bit more fresh for me. And my only question to myself was, do I release the trap first? So I'm like, this is the problem, and then I release picking up the pieces. This is the healing. Or do I do it the other way round? Because actually the overall message is meant to be the healing. So I thought if I release the problem first, then I might be just making it seem like the whole album is about the problem. So I thought I'll release the sort of recovery first, and then I'll release the problem. So that was the thinking behind it. But then, yeah, it's actually not at all strategic. So I just don't even know what I was thinking. And it probably seems like it's a sort of like a statement, but it wasn't.
Well, you know what, actually, having heard you unpack that, I think, if I may, I think what comes through to me is, I guess it depends on how you're looking at the album, because although this is a guitar album, it's also your debut composer album. So I suppose if you're coming at this expecting it to be an all-singing, all-dancing firework display on the guitar, then yes, you could argue that maybe in a track where you are more a supportive role maybe wasn't the best choice. But if you're looking at this as your debut composer album, which, based on how you're talking now, you seem to view it in that context just as much, if not more so, than the guitar side of it, it's a very logical choice to go for because it beautifully encapsulates a lot of the themes of the album itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that was sort of the way I was thinking about it. And I probably see myself, in my head, I sort of see myself as like a singer-songwriter, just not that I'm really singing or writing songs, but it's sort of that, those are the types of people. Again, I'm using that term very loosely because a lot of the people I listen to the most, I don't know if you could really call Kate Bush a singer-songwriter, but it's sort of a person who performs their own music. And it's quite a lot about the creation and the thing that they've created, and then the performance feels like it exists in order to bring the creations to life. So I think that's sort of the way I'm thinking about the album.
Absolutely, absolutely. You've led us nicely to the next track I wanted to talk about, because we've talked about the resolution, the solution, the healing. Let's now get to the problem. So, the second single you released, The Trap. Again, I loved this recording. I thought it was wonderful, but people haven't come here to hear me gushing about what I think about it. We're here to hear your perspective, the composer and the artist. So, unpack this one for us, Laura. What are the themes underpinning for it? What does it mean to you?
So it's kind of a piece, it's about feeling like you've lost your sense of self, and as if you're kind of being gradually controlled, and so it sort of begins very slowly, and things start to happen, and you're sort of not quite realizing until you just find yourself completely trapped, and it's very difficult to get out of the situation because it's all happened so slowly and you sort of haven't realized, and the whole thing has really got inside you and got to your sort of the core of who you are and your insides.
That's really, really interesting, because the thing I like most about this particular track is the story that's clearly underpinning it. And I thought this was beautifully put together in that wonderful music video you released to support the release of the single itself. I hazard a guess things like the tide coming in reflect that, you know, it's you don't know it's happened until it's too late, so to speak. There's all this wonderful symbolism that's going on within that music video, and it's worth mentioning for our watchers and listeners. Most guitarists and performers do music videos, and it tends to be they book a venue, they sit in a room with their instrument, and people film them playing something. This is a proper music video. There's acting, there's a story, you know, you get my point. It's a serious creative undertaking that tries to put a visual representation to the music. Let's talk about that, because most people have never really unpacked a video like that. You know what I mean? I've never filmed one like that. Most artists haven't, and very rarely do they get talked about. What was it like to film that video, Laura? And crucially, to what extent were the two creative processes running at the same time? Did you have that specific story in your mind when you were creating the music, or were they completely separate processes?
Not really, they were mostly separate in this one. It was really interesting actually creating the video, because we had a day where we just met and talked about ideas. Then we had a day where we went around filming prototypes, and then Gretchen also did a bunch of prototypes and tried all these different ideas. Like, I think she tried something with sort of pouring water on her head, and she had to get someone else involved. I'd always had this idea, this was there from the beginning, that at the end I was in the void and I was doing a dance, a strange dance in the void. And already that didn't even make sense, because the end is meant to be like the person, in my head, the person who's telling the story is kind of, they've sort of disappeared by that point, by the end. And so have you ever seen Stranger Things?
I can't say I have, no.
So there's this sort of place that's called the Upside Down, but there's a kind of place in between the two worlds. I can't remember what it is anyway. And it's this huge, huge black space, black sort of just a complete void. And then the person in the middle is really, really tiny. And so I had that in my head, but that tiny figure is sort of on the floor, and they're like maybe unconscious or something, or you don't know if they're conscious or not. But then at the same time, I also had the idea that I was dancing in the void. And I don't really understand how these two things can exist at the same time. It just doesn't make sense, but it's just what I've got in my head. So I kept saying, I have to be dancing in the void, I have to be dancing in the void. And we even went on the beach and like did some tests where I went on the rocks and was doing the dance. And then in the end, Gretchen had this idea. Gretchen came up with the idea in the sea. That was all her idea. And of course, we had the idea that there was the general concept of water rising and sort of drowning and things. And we were thinking a swimming pool originally. And then I was like, okay, well, we were thinking I would be underwater. So I was like, I better go to the swimming pool and see if I can go underwater. I've never tried before because I'm quite wimpy in the water. And I was like, I really tried, and I kept going down and I couldn't get down. And I was like, I don't think this is going to work. I'm going to need some sort of a diving instructor if we're going to do this approach. So that got discarded. And then Gretchen came up with the idea with a sheet, that we would have a sheet and a black sheet, and she and Roanna held it, and that I would be doing the dance. So that's kind of the dance in the void, but it also represents like the idea of maybe being under the waves, under the water. So it somehow everything seemed to click with that. And then the beginning of the video, I'm in the mirror, and I had kind of been thinking about a mirror quite early on with the piece. And then the sort of shots of me being like in town doing random things. That was Roanna's idea, that she said, oh, what if you were just in town and you were like going into a shop and paying for something, which we didn't do in the end. But it was like multiple days of filming and of trying things and trying out ideas. And then because of, budget reasons, because they were kindly doing it to help me out, but I couldn't then, they wouldn't be able to edit it, and I couldn't really pay somebody to do it. So I was like, I guess I'll have to learn to edit video then. So then I had to learn to edit video, especially for this video, which was pretty complicated. So yeah, it was all really a process. And so the way that the video looks in the end, we didn't know that when we were filming what it's going to look like at the end. We knew a few things, like the sea shots will work like this, but we didn't know everything.
Very interesting. And it does sound, to a certain extent, you had a fairly clear idea of the narrative you wanted from the composition that went into it. And I'm delighted we've also discovered that even when you did try to drown yourself in the swimming pool, you didn't succeed. That's that's a wonderful take from all this.
I definitely wasn't trying to drown myself. I was simply trying to go under the water so that I was thinking I would be like this. I was thinking I would do the dance underwater, the void dance, but I just could not get myself low down enough to be able to raise my arms and still be under the water. And then I was explaining to a friend, like, I can't get underwater. She was like, have you never been under the water before? And I was like, no. Because, you see people doing it in the swimming pool, but it's not something I've ever done.
Wonderful. I'd like to turn our attention to one more track that I'd like to talk about in a bit of detail. And I better come clean here. I'm going to be a little bit selfish. I've chosen this one because it's my favourite. I'm talking of the track that you called The Dragon's Lair. This is without doubt my favourite track on the whole album. I love the guitar playing, I love the spoken word parts, and on the video you released to support it, I think the dance choreography to tell the story with you performing as well, with the spoken word part and on the guitar, it's magnificent. I love this track. But again, people don't want to hear me talking about this and saying what I think's good about it, they want to hear you. What is this composition, Laura? Unpack it for us.
Yeah, so this one is really interesting because I started writing it. I was teaching on a music course in Italy, and I started writing it then. And then right from the beginning, I was visualizing a scenario. I was visualizing this corridor, and I was visualizing a specific person, Roanna, who I've mentioned already, doing movements to go with the piece and me at one end. I sort of had a vision for it right from the start. And Roanna and I had worked together in the past on projects of hers, which were based around improvisation. So there would be, for example, a theme. That the first one we did, I think that the theme was, broadly speaking, like the theme of madness. That was like a word that had cropped up. Roanna and some other movement artists were doing stuff inspired by, I think it was writings by a particular writer who was also on the project. So they were doing movement, and then I was improvising to their movements. But then they would then start improvising to what I was doing, and it would be like this kind of cycle. And I remember at one point they started spinning, and I think that was meant to represent becoming more and more mad. And I started going faster and faster, and then they just kept spinning, and I was like, oh my goodness, how am I going to go any faster? Like, what can I do? And it forced me to almost like break out of my shell and find another layer, because I had to, because they kept going. And it also allowed me to bypass my thinky brain, because I didn't have time to think at all. And ever since then, I feel that my entire approach to composition has shifted really from that one workshop that we'd done, because it showed me a way of just accessing something very directly without being thinky. And so I've since then been doing so much more through improvisation. And so midway through writing the piece, I decided to contact Romana and to start working on everything already. So she started improvising the movements, and I was playing most of what I'd written already, but a few finishing touches were added through the process. And I had a very clear vision for that video from the beginning. And it was really interesting trying to then make it happen. And there were so many different components that needed to happen because, for example, okay, first of all, I needed a corridor, and that was actually weirdly hard to find an appropriate corridor. In the end, it's not exactly a corridor, it's a sort of, it's not quite a corridor really, but I probably spent like 15 hours just Googling and scouting for corridors and going to different places trying to find a corridor. And then it was like, okay, great, you've done that. And then finding someone who'd be able to film it, rehearsing it all with Romana. Then there was things like, okay, what are we going to be wearing? Then I was sort of thinking, should I have some kind of eye makeup? Because I would normally not wear any specific eye makeup other than maybe a small amount of mascara. I felt like, oh, maybe I should have eye makeup. If you watch the video, it probably does hardly look like I'm wearing eye makeup, but in my head, because I'm not used to wearing eye makeup, it's quite a lot, you know. So then I started learning about makeup, watching loads and loads of makeup tutorials and practicing it in quite a scientific way. Like I'd be like one evening, okay, try a look, okay, wipe it all off, try again, and and then taking photos and sending it to them and being like, is this the right look? So.
We're getting a fascinating snapshot into your average evening here, Laura.
Yeah, exactly. This particular evening where I had a friend here who was like having some beers and watching me as I was just doing this process over and over again. But I'm saying all of this to say that sort of the detail that goes into just one video, it kind of made me realise when you, obviously, if you were doing it on a bigger scale, with a big budget, you would have then like a hair person, a makeup person, a costume person, a lighting person, a location scouting person, and all the different things. But we were just trying to like work it all out ourselves. And yeah, even I remember there was a whole thing with lipstick, because I tried all these different lipstick colours. I don't normally wear lipstick, but then in the end we concluded I don't think the character wears lipstick, because my character's kind of very cold, and they sort of make things happen. They manipulate people and just make things happen without really trying it. And it was a bit like, this person is too cold and effortless, but not the good kind of effortless, to even be wearing lipstick. Like that would be trying too hard for them. That's not the character's vibe. But it was quite funny that I had this whole foray into lipstick, which then many people got involved with, like advising which colour. And in the end, it was like, no.
Absolutely. It's fascinating hearing about the process as well. And something you said reminded me a lot of my work as a flamenco guitarist, because I don't think a lot of people realise that unless you are accompanying in an improvisatory way with something like dance, to a large extent, you are often limited by your own head, in the sense that the composition is very much a product of up here and comes out from there. When you're working with a dancer, certainly in flamenco, they get to control the tempo, they get to control the intensity. You have zero control over that. You simply have to follow. And if you do not follow appropriately, you failed fundamentally at the job you are meant to do. So you often have to reach to places that you would not normally go to in order to deliver that. And it sounds like you had a very similar experience when you were composing this.
That's really interesting. And yeah, that is exactly it. Yeah.
Fascinating. It's without doubt my favourite track on the album. I think it's absolutely superb. So thank you for composing it, and thank you for that wonderful video you put out.
Thank you.
Now, Laura, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the actual music side of the album, but I'd like to pivot now to talking about the production of the album in a broader sense. I find when I talk to people who don't work in the arts, they not unreasonably think that the creation of an album is a very normal, natural process, and essentially you come up with an idea, you compose some music, you record it, and then you release it. Now, in a very kind of low resolution way, yes, technically speaking, that is what goes into an album, but underneath each one of those bullet points is about 500 things that you've got to do and think about, and each one of those has 500 that come off it, and it turns into a horrible Pandora's box of issues you have to try to overcome to create that. With that in mind, let's talk about the journey you went on from the inception of the idea to the point you're at now where you've got the album finished and it's ready for the public to enjoy. Describe that journey. What was it like?
Really, really challenging. I would say that other than maybe my second Julian Bream Trust concert, where I had to learn more than 2 hours worth of material that I wasn't really playing before, for a very, very high pressure concert at Wigmore Hall, and spend like 2 years learning it. Other than that, this has probably been the most challenging project I've ever done, just in terms of the time it took and the various components. I think probably both of those things were equally challenging in different ways.
I can understand that. The first time I saw you live was at that concert, and there was a lot of playing.
Yeah, exactly. I seem to remember it ended with 30 minutes of music by Rodrigo, and music by Rodrigo is hard. So yeah, it was a program devised by Julian. So I learned it all, but it was very, very difficult. Yeah, so I found this very, very, very difficult. I think if I did it again, I'd probably find it a bit less hard, because now I'd know some of the things that I didn't know. Because first of all, the first thing I did was deciding what I was going to record. Then I was like, okay, well, you need to write quite a lot of the music then, don't you? So I wrote at least 5 new pieces, I think, for the album. And then which is quite a few actually, just to do. And then I applied for funding, and even just doing like one funding application is really time consuming and difficult. And I did multiple funding applications, and my sister helped me, which was really nice of her. And my sister helped me with a lot of the process. She doesn't know about the industry, but she just helped me by asking me, like, well, what is it that you need to do next? How could you do that? Okay, let's see next week if you have done that or not. So we had these quite regular meetings for maybe the first year or year and a half, where she would sort of just be a bit like a person to check that I was keeping going and doing what I was supposed to. And then I had to, even something simple like finding a venue to record in. For some reason, a lot of the churches I had recorded in the past had bats in them, and I have a real sort of phobia of bats. I can't remember if I've told you about Batgate. We won't discuss it. But anyway, so it was like, I can't have a venue with bats, and I've obviously got various other requirements to do with sound and things like that, and location. And so even something simple like finding a location, that was difficult. And then there's many complications to do with like things you have to apply for, like licenses and certain numbers and certain things that I didn't know about, that I found very complicated. And then even like designing album artwork, when you're sending it to print to a company, you have to decide which company to use, but then they will have certain specifications and it has to be done to exactly those specifications, otherwise it's going to come out printed funny, like So then you're either having to ask somebody to help you with design, or you're having to learn like a program like InDesign or Photoshop or something. So every single stage I just found unbelievably complicated, and I don't know if I'm just making things way more complicated than they are. I probably am to some degree, because I'm probably making so much, I'm taking everything so seriously and every little thing, and maybe it would be better to just be like, oh, just do whatever, just do something, whatever. But yeah, I found it really, really hard.
Well, let's riff on that a little bit, because what's come through very clearly in what you've just described is this album you've just put out is what we would call, for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with this term, this is what we would call an independent release. And to briefly summarise what that is, for those who don't know, that essentially means there's not a record label involved. The artist themselves essentially is the person that does everything. Now, let me just unpack that a little bit, because it relates to some of the things you've just talked about. I think a lot of people assume that the music industry that exists now is the same one that existed in the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s. In other words, people who are great artists, they have a record label that deals with everything to do with records. They have a legal team that deals with all the legality stuff and all the admin and paperwork. They have an agent that deals with anything to do with promotion and tour related stuff. They have PR people that deals with any... You see what I mean? They think that every artist has 20 professionals dealing with all this stuff. And the simple truth is, in the modern world, certainly for the past 15 years, unless you're Taylor Swift or Beyonce, you don't have that. Very few artists have... You've got to be making $500,000 to $1 million profit per year to have any hope of having that set up. And as a result, most artists, especially ones doing the... I don't want to say... I don't want to sound pretentious and say, you know, the more serious arts, but you know what I mean. The art that falls out of the popular music genre, shall we say, tend not to have that. And as a result, doing an album like you just described, it's really hard. It's a process that takes years, and you're essentially having one person who historically would essentially be the artist, and their job was to compose stuff and then go and tour it and record it. They're suddenly having to be the CEO, the project manager, the PR person, the financier. The list goes on and on and on and on and on. And as you say, it's a very long and it's a very stressful process. And for those who are listening who are trying to kind of have something to compare it to, what I would say is this: the closest most people have to this in their life is when they organise their own wedding. That's the only thing that you will experience in your life that comes close to trying to do an album. It's a huge job. Let's talk about that a little bit, because I think it's incumbent upon us as artists to kind of just let people know what that's like. What were the highs, Laura? What were the lows? And what were the lessons that you think, I need to take that into other things I do moving forward so that it works in a way that I'm happier with next time? Let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I think the highs were any kind of creative collaboration. So the collaborations with Miranda and Gretchen, the collaborations with the musicians, and it was so nice being able to write the piece with Amy, and also Loz, the bassist. That was really special because I was just composing one day and I suddenly just had this really weird thought in my head, like, bass, it needs bass. And I was very excited, and I texted my sister, and I was like, bass, it needs bass. And then I started doing like prototype recordings, and I was like, have I just gone mad? Or because sometimes I get an idea that pops into my head, and sometimes I think that might be a really bad idea, and I don't know why it's just come in your head. It's things that just come out of nowhere like that. So I couldn't tell, is this a very bad idea or is this a very good idea? But I was just so excited, and it all happened quite quickly. And I found him, and then we started working together and creating the bass parts. And I feel like that quick kind of turnaround, that's something that I really appreciate, because having a really long-term project where it's like, at some point in 2 years, this will be finished. I find that very, very difficult to manage mentally. I think people get a similar thing when they do a PhD. Probably that's probably worse because it's a longer and it's kind of full time. But nevertheless, maybe I might have experienced a little bit of what people describe with that, and I felt like, yeah, anything where it was just, oh, let's create a bass part for this piece. I'm going to come round tomorrow and then we're going to work on it and then we're going to think about it for a week and then go back and do it next week. That things like that felt really nice, the creative collaborations. I loved working with John Taylor, the audio engineer. He's so good and he's just the nicest person. I think he's such a beautiful person, and he's so admirable. He's got really admirable qualities, and it feels so nice to work with someone that you feel like you really like them as a person, and they feel like they're really invested in the project, and he's just great. So I loved that as well. And then I think anything that really wasn't the creative part, I found much harder. Yeah, and in terms of what I feel I've learned, I think to some degree it's given me like a little bit of confidence that I might be capable of certain technology-based tasks that I had zero confidence in and thought I absolutely could not do. So for example, like the video editing, or when I had to do the album artwork, I asked someone else to do it initially. Like I designed it in a rough way, and then I was like, can you like make this nice on InDesign and do it properly? But then later more edits had to be made, so I had to learn how to do it for myself in the end anyway, and to create other various bits of artwork to go with like the singles and things like that. And so just things like that, like learning to use a program and using Google, I just really never thought that I would manage that. So that was quite confidence inducing. But in terms of, I think just for the time being, I think it will probably be better for me to do projects that are shorter term, where I can go, I've had an idea, let me make it and do it now and release it like in 3 weeks or something. Just little things that are like that, because the feeling of having such a huge thing to manage that has so many components, like just writing one piece is already hard, and then you're saying I'm going to write 5 pieces, but then I'm also going to record them, but then I'm also going to make really complicated videos for some of them, and just even making one of those videos is really hard. I loved doing those things, but it was just the feeling of it being part of such a big thing is mentally like almost too overwhelming for me. Yeah, so I just wonder if I should do slightly more short-term things for a little while.
I can understand that, because I suppose the problem with an album is, I suppose to a certain extent it is lots of little tasks, but unfortunately it's not finished until absolutely everything's finished. So yeah. there's not a kind of clear sign-off point, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I'd like to come back to the compositions in a general sense for one more question, if I may. One thing I've always found interesting about the way you compose, Laura, and it's very much kind of come through on this album. Ever since I first saw you perform, the compositions that you perform that I think are just fantastic tend to be the ones that feature the human voice in some way. Whether it's a singing part or whether it's a spoken word part, it tends to have the voice in there. What is it about the voice that inspires you so much as a composer?
Yeah, I don't really know. I think I've always liked the idea of singing, and my dad, when I was young, he sang songs with his guitar, and he sang with these 2 other men, and they sang in harmonies, and I've often sung with my dad, and I still do. Like when I go home for a holiday or for Christmas or something, we will often sing. He might sing, I might sing, we might sing together in harmonies. And I feel like singing is something that other members of my family like to do as well. And I love listening to singers. I love the sort of immediacy and emotion and just connection that can be achieved with a voice and with singing. I mean, there's a lot more that I'd like to do with my voice in future, and places I'd like to take it and things I'd like to work on to widen my vocal palette. But I think it's just a sort of instinct within me that I, in a way, in quite a childish way, I want to sing.
I think that's wonderful. We're pretty much at the end of our discussion now, Laura. But before I ask you my final question, just remind our watchers and listeners one more time, if they've enjoyed this discussion and are thinking I'd love to check this album out, where are the best places for them to go to find it?
Yeah, so I've put it on Bandcamp, which is digital and CDs in certain territories, and then also it's on all the usual streaming, download, internety places.
Wonderful. By the way, for those watching and listening, it's worth me saying something that I'm sure Laura's far too modest to say, but I'm going to do it. This is a fantastic album, and although you may possibly watch it on a streaming service, it always helps the artist a lot more if you buy a physical copy. With that in mind, I politely suggest if you enjoy it on the streaming services, please do buy a physical copy as well. It makes a huge difference to the artist. Now, Laura, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our discussion now. It's been absolutely fantastic. My final question for you. I think whenever one listens to an album, one always has a track that really speaks to us. On your album, for me, that was The Dragon's Lair. But I'm curious, what's your favourite track?
Oh, I have a few. Oh no, am I allowed to have a few?
I'll let you have two.
Oh. Right now, I sort of like the one, I've kind of gone through phases with them. I think I tend to like the newer ones just because they're a bit fresher and they're like where my brain is at right now. I tend to like the things I've recently written the most, which is kind of promising, I guess. But it's like, you know, that I wouldn't write it if I didn't like it at the time. But then sometimes I reflect on things later and I think, oh, actually, I don't know if I really liked that or I don't like it anymore. But the most recent things I've presumably written it for a reason. But one that I like at the moment is called The Unknown. And it has quite a funny story behind it because it was the first piece that I wrote for the album, and it was just an improvisation. It was done in like 4 or 5 minutes, and I'd recorded it on my phone. I can't remember when, maybe 2022 or something like that. It was a long, long time ago. I actually thought it was going to start with a very creepy nursery rhyme and then go into the song, into the piece, but I got rid of that idea in the end. And then I sort of forgot about it, and I started writing other things, and I got that piece was going to be the first piece on the album originally. And then I got new ideas about the rest of the music and what else there would be. And then as it got closer to recording the album, I thought, hey, what about that thing that you improvised? Maybe we should find it. So I found the track, but then I was very confused because I couldn't work out what tuning it was in. And it was like in a really weird tuning, and there seemed to be a glass slide involved, and there was humming, and I just could not work it out. And I sent it to my friend who's a pianist, because she's very positive and encouraging. And she was like, surely we can work this out. And I was just like, no, we can't, we just can't. And she was like, well, this doesn't make sense. Of course we can. So I was like, she was like, send it to me, send it to me. So I sent it to her. And I mean, this is ridiculous because she's a pianist, so it's kind of embarrassing that she should be the one having to work it out. She does know a lot of guitarists, but so I sent it to her, and she actually worked it out amazingly. And the reason why I had not got it right was that I could tell that I had a glass slide on the strings, but I assumed I had the slide on all of the strings because that's kind of the only way you could do it. Like you have the slide on and then you're like moving it up and down. But she was like, I'm convinced that the bottom 3 strings are an octave lower than what you're doing. And I was like, this doesn't make sense. But then I realised that or maybe it was the top 3 strings were an octave lower. I had the guitar on my lap and I was using the slide on only 3 of the strings. And that's why none of it made sense. And so then I was able to transcribe the improvisation. And then I spent some time like finishing it up because it wasn't quite, there was a few loose ends that needed tying up and it needed an ending. But maybe the first 2 or 3 minutes were pretty much as is on the improvisation. And then in the recording with John Taylor, that was the very last track that we recorded. And I remember I wanted to do one more take and he was a bit like, oh, I think we've got it. Like, I think it's probably fine. And I was like, please, one more. And he was like, okay, one more and then we're done. And then, because, you know, you have to like, you can't just let people go over and over and over and over because they drive themselves nutty. And also it actually, you kind of start getting worse after a while. It's just not useful. So it's actually good that he, like using his experience, is able to like say when something's done or not done. But I was like, oh, can we just do one more? So I did one more, and then that one ended up being the one that we used, and we didn't edit it at all. So it's just like the complete take as it is. So I just like the fact that that was the very first thing I made for that album. That was kind of almost like a complete improvisation by itself, that I couldn't work out how to play it, and Irena had to help. And then at the end, it was the very last thing that I wrote.
Wonderful. And you said you wanted one more.
Yeah. I might go with. Oh. No, I'm just going to go with that one for today. Actually, I think. Yeah. Because then it's one that we haven't spoken about as well. That's nice.
It's a very fine choice indeed. And with that, Laura Snowden, thank you for coming on the show and talking music.
Yay! Thank you for having me.